We shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be. We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender.
He sounded pretty inebriated in that speech, didn't he? But I wonder if Churchill could see what the modern incarnation that the UK has transformed itself into, would he have even cared? Would he have just thrown up his arms, downed another drink, and let the Nazi war machine waltz in and occupy Whitehall? What would be the difference? Could it be any worse? Churchill is one of the best known, and some would say one of the greatest statesmen of the 20th century. The number of awards, honors, and accolades that were bestowed upon him are innumerable, from an honorary U.S. citizenship to being offered a dukedom of London, a city whose name had never been used in a peerage title. In 2002, BBC TV viewers and website users voted him the greatest Briton of all time. This is Paul Weston, who is the chairman of the Liberty GB political party, and while a candidate in the European elections in 2014, he was arrested in Winchester, Hampshire, for making a speech. His speech was a verbatim reading of Churchill's book, The River War, written in 1899 while he was a British Army officer serving in the Sudan. And let's just say, given his experience with Islam, his views were not politically correct in any sense of the word. When local Muslims took offense to the words of Churchill being spoken by Weston, 6 to 7 police officers were called upon to investigate his alleged crimes. And he was arrested on the suspicion of religious and racial harassment for reading the words of Churchill, the greatest Briton of all time. In the wake of the brutal and savage murder of the British soldier Lee Rigby on the streets of the capital city of the United Kingdom by Islamist jihadists, the London police swang into action to protect the public at large. No, I'm just kidding. They went around arresting people in the middle of the night if they had made any kind of anti-Islamic comments on Twitter. In the first few days after Rigby was run down, stabbed, and then hacked to death with meat cleavers, the police were busy making society safer by apprehending at least 11 individuals who had made malicious comments about Islam on Facebook and Twitter. In the city of Rotherham, a sexual abuse scandal of more than 1,400 little girls lasted from 1997 till 2013. It was diabolical in its organization and methodical in its depravity. And what made it even more insidious was the blind eye that authorities turned to the torture, rape, and pimping of children because the victims were white girls and the organized rapists were Pakistanis. But once the story got out, the authorities made sure that they were backing the victims and their families. No, sorry, I'm just kidding again. Actually, the Rotherham Council and police wanted powers to ban anti-child rape protests. I'll say that again. They wanted to ban people from protesting against the organized, systematic torture, rape, and pimping of little girls, some as young as 12, and described as barely pubescent. And that it went on for more than a decade because, they said, in their words, protests against them were becoming prohibitively expensive to police. The tiny isle of Bute in the Firth of Clyde, which had a total population of just 6,498 in 2011, is expected to take in around 1,000 Syrian migrants, with 12 families having arrived already this year. The British police have promised not to tolerate any speech that could cause offense on social media regarding Syrian migrants, and have already arrested a 41-year-old local man for Facebook comments he made about recent arrivals on his small Scottish island. The law that's being thrown at most people is Section 127 of the UK Communications Act of 2003, which is used for speech that is grossly offensive or of an indecent, obscene, and menacing character. But what constitutes grossly offensive is ill-defined, and its wide net seems to be growing by the day. For example, one can use the Hadiths and Quran to explain that Muhammad, the Prophet of Islam, while in his 50s, married a child of 6 and sexually penetrated her at 9, or that he had ordered 12 and 13-year-old boys to be beheaded, forced his adopted son to divorce his wife so that he could add her to his impressive harem, that he recommended wife-beating and beat his own child bride, that he demanded the killing of apostates, that he advocated the drinking of camel urine, and the obvious approval of sex with children, killed somebody for insulting him, extorted money from religious minorities, and encouraged the keeping of women as sex slaves. To publicly bring up the character of Muhammad, as outlined in the Hadiths and Quran, is offensive to many Muslims, as they tend to shy for non-Muslims, or kufr, to learn the personal details of Allah's apostle.
Alongside the social art crew. Big things! Yeah man, throw them under the fire. Yeah, one upon them, more fire, more fire, more fire. We'll put the Indian, them I say. We will put the pagan, them I say. When we say no, we boy. No name better you for this believer. But we have to call them dirty go far. Them no respect the Almighty One. Don't know the hell I'm a go bun. No name better you for this believer. But we have to call them dirty go far. Them no respect the Most High One. Don't know the hell I'm a go.
Sorry, I had to throw that in. Regardless of its message, I've always thought it had a catchy tune. But a dirty kufr is the pejorative used by Muslims to describe non-Muslims. Think of the N-word for blacks. Anyway, to broadcast knowledge of these behaviors of Muhammad, as outlined in the Islamic texts themselves, is a crime in the UK. Because for many nominal Muslims, they themselves have no idea about the personal example of their prophet. And those that do understand that the kufr tend not to venerate or laud the biography of the Prophet of Islam, but are usually horrified by Muhammad's behavior. But the state's use of its police to silence dissent is not only limited to the UK. In the Netherlands, the Dutch cops are policing anti-mass migration comments, even threatening social media users of sedition for opposing government policies. The news has emerged after police paid visits to warn multiple people who had made anti-migration comments on social media. Mark Jogenel was one of these individuals that was threatened with sedition after he tweeted, "The College of Sliedrecht has a proposal to receive 250 refugees coming in 2 years." What a bad plan! It's not even limited to Europe. The Supreme Court of Canada, in a ruling, has stated that truthful statements can be presented in a manner that would meet the definition of hate speech, and that not all truthful statements must be free from restriction. And in Germany, the government there is now demanding that tech giants such as Google and Facebook assist them in monitoring and censoring of any postings that are critical of the current migration crisis. In the wake of the sexual rampage Chancellor Angela Merkel's migrants visited upon the city of Cologne on New Year's Eve, the government has labeled any criticism of uncontrolled millions arriving to the country and being given state handouts as hate speech. But the chill that is set into people's ability to express their minds and opinions freely is not only being crushed by an increasingly Orwellian government, as much of the West itself has become a Frankenstein hybrid of the Gulag mentality of Pol Pot's Cambodia mixed with a dash of Huxley's Brave New World in terms of the ever-narrowing spectrum of officially sanctioned opinions and the masses' eager willingness to accept the dwindling of their personal freedoms. For all intents and purposes, the countries of the West are thought dictatorships with rampant censorship and persecution of anyone who strays from enforced opinions. We've already looked into the judicial oversight and punishment of incorrect opinions, but for most, it never escalates to state intervention. Most people self-censor. Ask yourself, have you ever thought about posting something on social media and then didn't because you were worried how those on your so-called friends list would react. Maybe it would make you less popular. Maybe even some would defriend you if you held an opinion that differed from theirs. Obviously, there are some that don't care about social pressure to conform, but there are still an enormous amount of people that do. Social control is just as powerful as the state's judiciary authority to shape and conform people to the bounds of what is acceptable discourse. And the real issue in the West has everything to do with the fear of being called racist, and hold that thought as we progress. Give an opinion that goes against the accepted narrative, and you may lose your job. You may be doxxed by those that want you to be economically impoverished for life for the opinions you have. In some cases, like dystopian Sweden, should you post something that is in any way offensive to those that are pretty much offended by anything and everything, then you may be visited at your home by a camera crew and a so-called journalist and asked why you are so filled with hate. Why do you want to see children starve? Why do you snicker at the disabled? Why do you feed puppies to crocodiles? It's no joke that you can lose your entire life to these people that take it upon themselves to police the thoughts of others and attempt to punish them socially and economically should they have a different opinion. But why? Why all of this oppression that comes out of every organ of the state, from academia, from the media, and from a zombified and controlled population? Why is the West losing its freedoms, and especially the freedom of conscience and expression? It's all about diversity and about forestalling the Western people's breaking point. The breaking point is met when people have less to lose than to gain by standing up. When a nation gets emasculated, only people who have got nothing to lose dare to do something. As well, a large percentage have everything from jobs to property to their family to lose when they stand up against what ails their society. And as far as the media tells them, they have relatively very little to gain. There's no universal breaking point either. You see it first in parts of the population, such as those that support the English Defence League in the UK, who come from lower working classes, who begin to express their disgruntlement earlier than the sneering hive minds of the middle and upper classes, who, by the way, will take the longest to express any juxtaposition to the narrative, as they can avoid the consequences of which for far longer. The question thus is, how soon will society reach its breaking point? When will it reach the average person, the core of society, and really take effect? After yearly terrorist attacks, after thousands of planned and organized rapes of women and children, after the billions of pounds, dollars, euros sunk into economic vampires that add no value to their host countries beside division, crime, and social tension, what will it take for an emasculated civilization that has made a religion of bending over and tolerating any manner of insult? The crux of all of this is that diversity is not a strength. Diversity is a civilizational handicap in the extreme. None of this, none of these speech codes, human rights tribunals, hate speech laws, intercommunity dialogue, nor anti-fascist groups, none of it is needed when you have a more homogeneous society. Look at Japan. They don't have a need for any of this for the simple reason they're a country that is almost entirely made up of, well, Japanese. They haven't joined the West for the last 40 years in this experiment with the mass importation of people from very disparate cultures. And as a result, while having their own problems, of course, they don't share in any of these self-inflicted problems stemming from the utopian delusions of vibrant diversity that the West is crippling itself with. A society with a fairly homogeneous culture is a more stable society that can have more personal liberties, social capital, and community cohesion. When did we lose our common sense as a civilization? None of this should be either profound or even debatable for any reasonable person. When you have diversity, you will inevitably have friction when you have people that have very different cultural outlooks all trying to have a say in the way things are run and having a lot of trouble finding consensus. And this will cause all sorts of problems and ends with what we are witnessing now, the erosion of free speech, the lowering of standards, and the catering to the more zealous, vicious of groups by giving them special privileges to appease them and not calling them out for their dysfunction for fear of their community's propensity for violence. A diverse society requires an ever more draconian government in an attempt to keep all competing factions in line. Homogeneity just decreases the number of potential conflicts within a society. For example, if there were no Muslims in Britain, there wouldn't be the underlying cultural tensions, nor would they have the grooming and raping of thousands of little girls in Rotherham and elsewhere. It never would have happened. If there were no Muslims in Germany, there would not have been the mass sexual attacks in Cologne. If there were no Muslims in Belgium, there would have been no jihadist attacks on the Brussels airport and metro in March 2016. In all ways, Belgium is one of the best examples of the absolute destruction that diversity visits upon any nation that is so unfortunate to become a guinea pig for this particularly extreme ideological experiment.
The big cities in Europe are the first places where we can see what will happen when the majority is Muslim. We see it in the big cities first, Brussels, Amsterdam also, Rotterdam, Antwerp.
Sam van Rooij has co-edited an important new Dutch-language book called Islam, Critical Essays on a Political Religion.
Islam is a fascist ideology, and it's not a religion like Christianity or like Judaism. And the danger in it is that it has a religious side, not like communism and Nazism, who are only ideologies, but Islam has a bit of both.
Imran is looking forward to replacing Belgian law with Sharia law. A showdown over Sharia is coming in Belgium because the high Muslim birth rate is changing the political landscape. The most common baby name in Brussels for 4 years running has been Mohammed.
You think it's a matter of time before Muslims are the majority here?
Yeah, of course. Even the disbelievers themselves, they say that in 2030, something like that, there will be a majority Muslims here in Belgium. Even the city, Antwerp, more than 40% of the children in the schools are Muslims. So it's just a matter of time. No problem. We don't have any problem.
And Imran offered this advice to white native Belgians.
If they want to push us back or something like that, I don't know. Maybe they can start to marry 4 wives and have a lot of children. Start with that, maybe they will have a chance, but I don't think so.
Van Rooij also sees a Muslim future.
I don't think it's gonna stop. I'm very pessimistic about it. I think more and more people, Belgian people, will leave Brussels. So it will come a real Islamic capital in decades.
The victory of Allah is very near, so I think that the West need to prepare themselves for a wave of Sharia in Islam.
The bombings in Brussels, at its airport and in its metro, are no surprise to anyone with a shred of common sense. And this is why Donald Trump, the presumptive candidate for the Republican Party, can win the White House. Not that he's a good man, nor the best man for the job. He's probably going to make a mess of the country if he does win, but it's now clear to a wide swath of the population that the political class is there to herd the sheeple, and it's actually the banks and the corporations that are really making policy. And as unfortunate as it may be, Donald Trump is the only public figure that is willing to say what everyone else is thinking, whether on issues of trade, military agreements, or civilizational, demographic, and cultural disenfranchisement. He's the only one. He's tapped into the public's utter disdain for the political class, and he may ride this revulsion of the public mood to victory. He was called a racist by the New York Times less than 2 months before the bombings for characterizing Brussels as a hellhole. Fast forward, in the direct aftermath, while politicians like Hillary Clinton were pontificating about working through our values or how terrorism makes democracy stronger and other assorted gobbledygook, Trump was speaking straight and saying and explaining the reality of the situation. He can win because despite all of his faults, he speaks to people rather than down to them.
Brussels is a disaster, and it's been a disaster. Brussels is an armed camp, and I'm not talking about today. You go down into Brussels now, it's an armed camp. If you went into Brussels 20 years ago, it was like a magical city. Right. It was a magical city, and now you look at it, it's an armed camp. Right. The whole thing is crazy, and it's not going to change. It's not going to get better. It's only going to get worse. It's in very bad shape, but many cities will be this way, and, with what's taking place. And it's really the policies of people that don't know what they're doing. It's people that don't know what they see what's happening, and yet they allow it to continue to happen. Well, you really, look, number one, you want to lead your life. You don't want to be living in an armed camp for your whole life. And there is a certain group of people that is making living a normal life impossible. And you just have to take a look at other cities. I mean, you go into Paris, there are places in Paris where the police are afraid to go. They don't want to go. It's so bad. And, I mean, we as a country have to learn what's going on. And, frankly, those countries better get smart fast because they're just disintegrating. And, Brussels, I have friends that live in Brussels. They say the place is literally disintegrating. And I'm not talking about today. I'm talking about generally speaking.
Right. Nations were formed to protect the interests of the groups that fell within their borders, usually formed along linguistic, ethnic, and cultural lines. A few of the countries that have been formed, like Belgium, with its Walloons and Flemish, or Canada, with her Anglo and Francophone populations, have always been houses divided. Now with the importation, the divisions are multiplying like cancer and are quickly beginning to bring an end to national cohesion throughout the West. Diversity is at the cost of an efficient and safe society. I love exotic food, but if having cuisine from around the world means a destabilized society, then I think it's time we think about buying a cookbook rather than importing the cook and his closest 75 family members. The West is throwing away in a generation what has worked for 1,000 years. And just like the Soviet Union's attempt to build a new man and a utopian society, it will fail, as the road to hell is usually paved with good intentions. Oh, and one thing that needs to be made clear here, Islam is not a race. Islam is a totalitarian ideology sprinkled with a bit of religion as window dressings. Islamophobia is a made-up word that's been wed with brown skin and hurled as an insult to any that question this ideology that is filled with bad ideas. It's the same as calling one a Scientology phobic, or a Buddha phobic, or a atheist phobic. The term is disingenuous, but it's been so successful precisely because it has imbued this ideology with the victimhood of non-Europeans and is tantamount to calling one a racist. And as previously stated, the fear of being called racist has even turned off the natural self-protection mechanisms in Western civilization. The Second World War traumatized the entire West. In its aftermath, utopian ideas for society were taken to be universal, but instead created blindfolds, usually made by politeness and constant manipulation of vocabulary, to the point where nobody can admit the simple truth anymore, because it's usually brutal. People in Europe, Canada, Australia, among others, believe that they have freedom of speech in their countries simply because they have watched too many Hollywood movies. The United States is the only country that has this freedom. But even there, the U.S., like all of the West, continues its slow decline while her people's freedom dwindles. It's simply madness or willful ignorance not to be able to see that the more diverse a society becomes, the less free it will be. We'll be looking more closely at the effects of diversity on society in an upcoming video. Please consider subscribing and following the Black Pigeon on Twitter and Facebook.